The night in Milan was a quiet symphony of distant footsteps, the occasional clatter of a late tram, and the gentle hum of streetlights flickering against the damp, cobblestone streets. The city, known for its fashion and bustling daytime energy, seemed to hold its breath after dark, as if waiting for a secret story to unfold. And in one of the shadowed alleys, a figure moved with a quiet confidence that seemed almost out of place among the quiet whispers of the night. That figure was Matteo Ardenti, though few outside certain circles would ever know his name, and fewer still would dare to speak it aloud. Yet, to those who did, he was known as Il Filosofo, the philosopher, a nickname that captured the paradox of a man who could be as serene and contemplative as he was ruthlessly strategic. Matteo's reputation was not born overnight, nor was it the result of flashy acts of violence or flamboyant displays of power. Instead, it was the result of a mind attuned to the rhythms of human behavior, a mind that observed, calculated, and predicted the movements of allies and rivals alike. In the calm shadows of Milan, he had learned to listen, really listen, to the city itself, the subtle shift of a passerby's gaze, the nearly imperceptible tension in a shopkeeper's stance, the whispers in the cafes that often carried more truth than official reports ever could. It was in these small, almost mundane moments that Matteo honed the philosophy that would guide his life, the strategy that would allow him to build a criminal empire without drawing the kind of reckless attention that destroyed so many others. As the cool night air drifted through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint aroma of freshly baked bread and the metallic tang of rain-soaked stone, one could almost sense the duality of Matteo's world. On the surface, Milan appeared peaceful, serene, even elegant. Yet beneath that calm lay a labyrinth of allegiances, rivalries, and unspoken codes, a hidden ecosystem of power that operated in whispers, glances, and subtle gestures. It was a world that Matteo understood better than most, not because he had been born into it, but because he had learned early to watch, to think, and to act with deliberate care. He moved like a shadow not because he sought to hide, but because he had learned the value of subtlety. Many in the underworld believed that power was demonstrated through overt displays, guns, intimidation, violence, but Matteo had always disagreed. To him, power was a quiet force, something that built slowly, like a stone wall rising brick by brick. Each decision, each alliance, each carefully considered move was another brick, laid with precision, designed not just to stand the test of time but to survive the storms of betrayal, law enforcement scrutiny, and human unpredictability. And in this city, where fortunes could rise and fall in the span of a single evening, that patience was not just prudent, it was essential. From the outside, one could almost romanticize the life of Matteo Ardenti. A thinker in the shadows, a man whose intellect surpassed his contemporaries, whose presence seemed to command attention without ever demanding it. But those who glimpsed the inner workings of his life understood the tension that accompanied every decision. Every choice carried consequences, some immediate and some unfolding slowly, like ripples across a darkened pond. Allies could turn, rivals could strike, and the law, ever watchful, could descend without warning. Matteo navigated this tension not with fear, but with calm deliberation, treating each challenge as a problem to be solved rather than an obstacle to be fought. It was in this manner that he built his reputation, not as the loud, brash gangster whose exploits were splashed across newspapers, but as the quiet strategist whose influence extended far beyond what most could see. To the casual observer, he might have seemed an ordinary man walking down a Milanese street, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, eyes scanning but never lingering, posture relaxed yet precise. Yet those who knew the signs, the subtle shift of his gaze, the way he listened to conversations without speaking, understood that he was always calculating, always observing, always planning the next move in a game whose rules only he fully understood. Even as the city slept, the threads of Matteo's empire were quietly weaving themselves into the fabric of Milanese life. Small businesses paid their dues without realizing the source of protection, neighborhoods remained undisturbed because the threats were neutralized before they could surface, and the underworld itself began to acknowledge the presence of a mind unlike any other. It was not fear that commanded respect, but recognition of brilliance, the acknowledgement that Matteo Ardenti played a different game, one where foresight, patience, and intellect were as lethal as any weapon. And yet, for all his calculated moves, there remained an air of mystery about Matteo, a sense that even those closest to him understood only fragments of the man behind the moniker. Stories circulated, quiet tales shared in hushed tones, painting a portrait of a philosopher who could outthink and outmaneuver anyone, yet who walked the fine line between contemplation and action with almost uncanny grace. What was it that drove him? Was it ambition, intellect, a hunger for power, or simply the desire to understand the world in its most raw, unfiltered form? Those questions lingered in the minds of those who sought to define him, yet no simple answer ever emerged. The calm of the night, the gentle rhythm of footsteps and distant murmurs, and the quiet presence of Matteo himself all combined to set the stage for a story unlike any other. A story of intellect navigating danger, of a mind forging an empire not through noise or violence, but through thought, observation, and precision. As the hours stretched on and Milan slept under the muted glow of streetlights, the city itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the journey that Matteo would take, through ambition, conflict, alliances, and betrayals. This was the world of Matteo Ardenti, Illinois Filosofo, a world built on patience, observation, and the delicate balance of power. A world that, to the untrained eye, might appear ordinary, quiet, even serene, but which beneath the surface carried the tension, strategy, and intellect of a man who would change the game of crime in Milan forever. As the listener drifts into the soft cadence of these words, the streets of Milan become alive not with action, but with quiet suspense, a calm that invites both reflection and curiosity. For what awaited Matteo in the shadows was a journey of thought and ambition that would stretch from the quiet corners of the city to the highest reaches of influence, and every step along the way would be guided not by impulse, but by the sharp, measured logic of the thinker who dared to forge a wall-bound empire. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the narrow windows of Matteo Ardenti's childhood home, casting long, warm streaks across the worn wooden floors. It was a modest apartment in a crowded Milanese neighborhood, a place where the clatter of shutters, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, and the distant hum of tram bells formed the backdrop of daily life. Matteo's early years were unremarkable to the casual observer, filled with chores, school, and the small dramas of a tightly knit family. Yet, even in those ordinary moments, there were subtle indications that he was destined for something extraordinary. His eyes, always observing, seemed to capture more than the casual glance, noting the way his neighbors interacted, how his father's stern voice shaped their household, and the rhythm of life that pulsed through the streets outside. His father, a man of strict discipline and quiet expectations, ran the household with a rigid sense of order. Matteo learned early the consequences of stepping out of line, but he also absorbed lessons in observation, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding one's surroundings. There was no love lost in harsh words or sudden reprimands, yet within that structure, Matteo developed a keen sense of timing and awareness. His mother, by contrast, offered gentle guidance, her calm demeanor providing the warmth and safety that balanced the household strictness. She read to him from worn volumes of poetry and philosophy, filling the small apartment with the soft cadence of language and the quiet encouragement to think deeply about the world. It was this delicate tension between discipline and nurture that shaped Matteo's early understanding of human behavior, the subtle dance of authority, trust, and influence that would later inform his every move in the shadows of Milan. The streets outside Matteo's home were alive with quiet, everyday chaos. Children chased each other through alleyways, merchants called softly to potential customers, and the scent of simmering sauces drifted from small trattorias tucked between buildings. To Matteo, these streets were more than just the backdrop of his childhood, they were a living classroom. He watched how pedestrians adjusted their paths to avoid conflicts, how shopkeepers negotiated quietly with regular customers, and how small disagreements were resolved with gestures rather than words. In these mundane exchanges, he learned lessons in negotiation, observation, and strategy, lessons that would later serve him far more effectively than any formal education could. School itself was a place of both challenge and fascination for Matteo. While other children were content with rote memorization and the repetition of lessons, he found himself drawn to the larger questions: why people acted the way they did, what motivated loyalty, and how power moved quietly through even the smallest social structures. Teachers often remarked on his reflective nature, his tendency to linger on questions that seemed beyond the reach of his peers. While he did not stand out for athletic prowess or social charm, his quiet intelligence and ability to analyze situations drew the attention of those who recognized the subtlety of his mind. Even in adolescence, there was a sense that Matteo was learning a different curriculum, one that would not be found in textbooks, but in the rhythm of life itself. Friendships for Matteo were selective, formed not out of need for social approval but out of careful observation and assessment. He gravitated toward those whose strengths complemented his own, those who offered insight into human behavior, or those who could be trusted not to betray confidence. In a world that would later become increasingly treacherous, these early relationships served as the foundation for understanding loyalty, trust, and the quiet power of alliances. He watched, quietly and thoughtfully, the ebb and flow of childhood conflicts, learning to mediate, to anticipate, and to respond with measured care rather than impulse. These skills, seemingly trivial in the innocence of youth, were the seeds of the strategic mind that would one day control a vast and intricate network in Milan. Despite the order and quiet contemplation of home and school, Matteo's neighborhood was not without danger. Milan, though far from the lawlessness often associated with other cities, had its shadows, areas where petty crime, rivalry, and the occasional act of violence occurred unnoticed by most adults. Matteo, even as a boy, navigated these spaces with a cautious curiosity. He learned to sense the unspoken rules of these streets, to read gestures, to anticipate conflict before it arose. These early experiences in observation and risk assessment, combined with his reflective nature, began to shape a mindset that could balance patience with boldness, intellect with action. Books became Matteo's refuge and his secret companion. From the worn pages of philosophy, history, and strategy, he absorbed lessons that would later underpin his approach to power and influence. The works of thinkers long gone provided not just theory but practical insight into human behavior, the dynamics of authority, and the ways in which a sharp mind could navigate perilous circumstances. In the quiet of his room, he traced connections between abstract thought and a tangible world outside his window, imagining strategies and considering outcomes as if rehearsing moves on a chessboard. This early immersion in intellectual discipline cultivated patience, foresight, and a contemplative calm that became his hallmark. Yet Matteo was not without mischief. Like any child, he tested boundaries, experimented with daring, and occasionally found himself on the edge of trouble. A stolen pastry from a corner bakery, a minor scuffle with a neighborhood rival, small acts of defiance, all these moments were not reckless but rather exercises in understanding consequences and human reactions. Through these seemingly trivial adventures, Matteo learned to gauge risk, read character, and act decisively when necessary. Each small encounter was a lesson in strategy, a rehearsal for the more consequential decisions that awaited him in adulthood. As Matteo moved further into adolescence, the quiet observation and reflection that had defined his early years began to meet the restless energy of youth. The streets of Milan were no longer just a classroom of subtle lessons, they had become a playground for curiosity, daring, and the occasional misstep. It was during these years that he began to explore the boundaries of right and wrong, testing the limits of what could be taken, borrowed, or bent without immediate consequence. Unlike many of his peers, who sought attention or excitement through loud defiance, Matteo approached each risk with the precision of a strategist. Every action was calculated, every move measured, as if the city itself were a chessboard and he were planning several steps ahead. His earliest ventures into what one might call criminal activity were small, almost imperceptible to those around him. A stolen loaf of bread here, a borrowed coin there, nothing violent, nothing overtly destructive. To the casual observer, he was simply a clever boy navigating the temptations of adolescence. But these minor transgressions were more than youthful indiscretions, they were exercises in understanding consequence, testing human behavior, and exploring the reactions of those in authority. Matteo learned quickly which adults were likely to punish immediately, which could be persuaded with charm, and which simply looked the other way. These lessons in manipulation, risk assessment, and social dynamics would prove invaluable in the years to come. The streets themselves seemed to respond to him differently now. He walked with a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that went unnoticed by most but subtly affected those around him. Shopkeepers might lower their voice when he lingered too long in their doorway, other boys paused their games when he approached, unsure whether to confront or avoid him. There was a strange magnetism in his presence, not born of size, strength, or aggression, but of observation, calmness, and an underlying awareness that he understood far more than he revealed. He had learned the art of appearing harmless while remaining alert, an art that would later define his approach to power and influence. It was during these formative years that Matteo first came into contact with the city's more organized elements of crime. Not the violent enforcers or feared gang leaders that newspapers would one day sensationalize, but the quiet operators, men and women who moved in the shadows, negotiating, smuggling, and bending rules without drawing unnecessary attention. Matteo observed them from a distance at first, fascinated by the precision of their operations, the careful choreography of meetings, and the subtle ways in which they commanded respect without resorting to force. He watched how loyalty was earned, how favors were tracked and repaid, and how influence could grow quietly, almost invisibly, until it was undeniable. These observations fascinated him far more than any childish game of petty theft or mischief. Despite his growing interest in these clandestine worlds, Matteo remained careful. He never took unnecessary risks, never flaunted his curiosity, and always maintained the appearance of an ordinary boy navigating adolescence. Yet even in this caution, there was a spark of ambition. He began to experiment with small-scale schemes that required more than daring, they required planning, observation, and subtle persuasion. Perhaps it was a small exchange of goods between neighborhood boys, orchestrating favors among his peers, or guiding the outcome of a minor conflict without drawing attention to himself. Each of these exercises strengthened his understanding of human behavior and strategy, and each small success reinforced the quiet confidence that he was learning a language others had yet to master. There were moments of danger, of course, even in these early years. Rival boys tested him, neighborhood authorities suspected him, and once or twice he came dangerously close to more serious consequences. But Matteo's calm, analytical approach allowed him to navigate these risks with minimal exposure. He learned to retreat when necessary, to charm when advantageous, and to strike only when confident that the result would be favorable. Unlike many who acted out of impulse or bravado, Matteo was guided by foresight, patience, and the careful weighing of potential outcomes. Even small confrontations became lessons in strategy, shaping his understanding of power and the subtle ways it could be exercised without overt violence. At the same time, Matteo's mind remained deeply engaged with intellectual pursuits. While his peers were distracted by sports or social games, he read voraciously, studied philosophical texts, and considered the patterns of human behavior he observed daily. Books became both refuge and teacher, offering lessons that complemented the practical education of the streets. He saw the connections between abstract thought and concrete action, between principles of logic and the dynamics of influence. Even in minor acts of theft or persuasion, he could trace the strategies outlined by philosophers or historical figures, testing theory against reality in a quiet, deliberate manner. Friendships and alliances formed during this period were equally deliberate. Matteo gravitated toward those who complemented his strengths or offered insight into areas he wished to understand. He was rarely drawn to the loudest or most violent boys, rather, he favored those who observed quietly, who could be trusted, or who provided opportunities for learning. Loyalty, trust, and reciprocity were central themes in these relationships, and Matteo began to understand that influence was rarely granted, it had to be cultivated, nurtured, and carefully managed. Even in adolescence, he recognized that the seeds of a powerful network were sown in subtle, seemingly insignificant interactions. By the age of 16, Matteo's reputation in his neighborhood was quietly established. He was known not as a troublemaker or a bully, but as a boy who seemed to anticipate events, who understood motivations, and who could orchestrate outcomes without attracting unwanted attention. People began to notice his calm presence, the way he listened more than he spoke, and the subtle manner in which he influenced others. There was an air of quiet authority about him, a sense that even in minor skirmishes or neighborhood disputes, he was always aware of the broader picture. This awareness would later define his approach to leadership, alliances, and strategic decision-making in the criminal world. Even his minor criminal ventures were conducted with a level of sophistication unusual for someone his age. He observed carefully, planned meticulously, and executed with precision. A stolen item was never a reckless act, it was part of a subtle test, a rehearsal for understanding risk, reaction, and consequence. In these small, controlled acts, Matteo was learning lessons far beyond ordinary adolescent experience. He was practicing patience, foresight, and the quiet manipulation of circumstance, all skills that would later become hallmarks of his empire. At night, as the city settled into its gentle rhythm, Matteo would often retreat to a quiet corner or a small rooftop overlooking the streets. From these vantage points, he observed life moving below, merchants closing shops, neighbors settling disputes quietly, the interplay of trust and caution that governed the city's social order. These moments of solitude allowed him to reflect, to connect the lessons of observation, intellect, and strategy into a coherent understanding of human behavior. It was here, in the calm of night, that the foundations of Matteo Ardenti's philosophy were solidified, a philosophy that would later guide his rise in a world where intellect, patience, and subtle influence were more powerful than brute force. Through these early experiences, minor crimes, careful observation, intellectual study, and strategic relationships, Matteo learned the quiet art of navigating the complexities of life. The streets of Milan became both teacher and playground, shaping his understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and influence. Each small success, each narrowly avoided failure, contributed to the growing confidence of a boy who was slowly but surely preparing for the larger challenges of the world beyond adolescence. By the time he reached adulthood, Matteo Ardenti would not simply enter the world of organized crime, he would approach it with a mind honed in both thought and action, a strategist capable of building an empire brick by brick, unnoticed by many, but felt by all who came into contact with his influence. By the time Matteo Ardenti had reached the cusp of adulthood, the quiet exercises of observation, strategic play, and intellectual curiosity had prepared him for a new phase of life, one that would introduce him to the hidden hierarchies and intricate codes of Milan's underworld. It was not an introduction born of chance, but of careful observation and a subtle display of competence that had caught the attention of a man whose influence ran quietly through the city's criminal veins. This man, older, disciplined, and respected in circles that few dared enter, recognized something in Matteo, a mind capable of thinking several moves ahead, a patience that contrasted sharply with the impulsive recklessness of many aspiring criminals, and a calm presence that commanded attention without ever needing to assert itself loudly. This mentor would become the first true guide in Matteo's understanding of organized crime, a figure whose lessons would linger in his mind long after their meetings ended. The first encounter between the two was unremarkable in appearance but monumental in consequence. Matteo had been observing a small smuggling operation at a quiet warehouse near the outskirts of the city, noting patterns, timing, and the interactions of various players. The older man approached quietly, his gaze sharp but not threatening, and spoke in measured tones, acknowledging Matteo's attentiveness and perceptiveness. There was no immediate demand, no sudden initiation, only a subtle recognition that this boy, no longer quite a boy, but not yet a man, possessed qualities worth cultivating. Matteo, ever cautious, responded with a mixture of respect and curiosity, sensing both opportunity and potential danger. This calm, measured exchange marked the beginning of a mentorship that would shape not only Matteo's approach to crime but also his philosophy of influence and power. The lessons Matteo received were not those of violence or intimidation alone. While he would certainly learn the necessary mechanisms of enforcement and control, the early teachings focused on observation, subtlety, and strategic patience. He was instructed to watch before acting, to listen before speaking, and to always consider the long-term consequences of every decision. In quiet rooms lit by a single lamp, over slow sips of espresso, Matteo learned to map the network of loyalties and rivalries that ran beneath the surface of Milan. He observed how respect could be earned without threats, how influence could spread without overt displays of power, and how the careful orchestration of relationships could achieve far more than brute force ever could. These meetings also introduced Matteo to the delicate art of discretion. He learned that in the world he was entering, knowledge was both power and vulnerability. Every observation, every conversation, every small action could carry weight far beyond immediate perception. The mentor emphasized the importance of appearing ordinary, of moving through the city unnoticed while simultaneously gathering insight and cultivating influence. Matteo absorbed these lessons eagerly, understanding that the true power of a criminal mind lay not in the acts of violence it could commit, but in the quiet strategies it could orchestrate. Under the mentor's guidance, Matteo began to participate in small, controlled operations designed to teach him practical skills while maintaining safety. He handled communications, coordinated minor exchanges, and observed negotiations, all under careful supervision. Each task was a test of intelligence, patience, and discretion, and each success reinforced the trust placed in him. Matteo's natural calm and ability to anticipate human reactions allowed him to excel, impressing his mentor with both the precision of his actions and the depth of his understanding. In these early ventures, Matteo began to understand a fundamental principle that would guide his later life: influence and control were cultivated over time, not seized impulsively. Equally important were the lessons in human psychology that Matteo received. His mentor taught him to read people, to notice small tells, and to predict behavior based on subtle cues. The first steps Matteo took toward building his own influence were quiet, deliberate, and almost invisible to those who did not pay close attention. He was no longer simply an observer or an apprentice, he had absorbed the lessons of his mentor and was ready to test them in the real world. These initial ventures were small, careful experiments, designed not to attract attention or incite conflict, but to gauge the reactions of allies, rivals, and the city itself. In many ways, these early operations were as much exercises in patience and observation as they were acts of ambition, each move carefully considered and executed with the calm precision that had become Matteo's signature. He began by focusing on sectors of the city that were largely overlooked by the more prominent operators: small shops, minor import businesses, and local markets where influence could be quietly extended without drawing notice. Here, he applied lessons in negotiation, subtle persuasion, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. Storekeepers who might otherwise have been wary found themselves offering favors, concessions, or information without fully realizing how they had been influenced. Matteo moved quietly, never forcing outcomes, never asserting dominance overtly. His power was exercised through intelligence, timing, and the slow accumulation of trust, laying the first bricks of an empire that would eventually grow far beyond the walls of these early neighborhoods. What distinguished Matteo from many of his contemporaries was his understanding of optics and perception. He knew that visibility could be both an asset and a liability, and he carefully managed how he was seen, or more often, how he was not seen. His early ventures relied on subtle influence rather than overt control. Deals were structured so that he rarely needed to assert himself directly; instead, he allowed others to feel as though they were acting of their own volition, while he guided outcomes quietly from the shadows. This approach not only minimized the risk of immediate retaliation but also allowed him to observe human behavior in its most authentic form, gaining insight into motivations, alliances, and vulnerabilities. These initial operations were not without challenges. Rival operators occasionally tested him, attempting to assert dominance or encroach on territories he had begun to influence. In these moments, Matteo's calm, analytical approach proved invaluable. He assessed threats quietly, choosing when to confront and when to redirect, always considering the long-term consequences of each action. There was no impulsive retaliation, no display of unnecessary aggression, only measured responses, calculated to secure his position while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Over time, this reputation for discretion and intelligence began to precede him, drawing both cautious respect and curiosity from those within the underworld. Another crucial element of these early ventures was Matteo's ability to network strategically. He did not seek to control everyone at once, rather, he focused on building relationships with individuals who could extend his influence, provide valuable intelligence, or serve as allies in future operations. Each relationship was cultivated with patience, observation, and subtle guidance. He listened more than he spoke, offering insight and assistance when appropriate, but always maintaining an air of quiet authority. Through these networks, Matteo began to understand a fundamental principle of power: influence could often be more effective than force, and the loyalty of others could be leveraged to extend reach far beyond immediate presence. Even as he expanded his influence, Matteo maintained a strong emphasis on careful record-keeping and planning. He documented interactions, noted behavioral patterns, and created mental maps of alliances, rivalries, and potential vulnerabilities. While others relied on reputation, intimidation, or impulsive action, Matteo relied on knowledge. His ability to anticipate reactions and plan several steps ahead allowed him to navigate complex situations with minimal exposure, laying the foundation for more ambitious operations in the future. The early stages of his empire were quiet, almost imperceptible, but meticulously structured, each move calculated to build stability, influence, and security. These operations also required Matteo to understand the economics of control. He learned to assess value, not just in monetary terms, but in strategic leverage, information, and relationships. Small concessions or favors could be traded for loyalty or insight, and seemingly minor interactions could have far-reaching consequences. Through careful observation and thoughtful application of these principles, he began to construct a system that was both resilient and adaptable, capable of weathering minor conflicts and exploiting opportunities as they arose. Even in these early stages, the seeds of his wall-bound approach, an empire tightly controlled and meticulously managed, were being planted. At the same time, Matteo never allowed his ambition to compromise his sense of discretion. Unlike many who sought rapid expansion through violence or flamboyant displays, he understood the dangers of drawing attention too soon. Each success was deliberate, each expansion measured, and each interaction carefully considered. He cultivated the appearance of an ordinary operator, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the city while quietly extending his influence. In doing so, he ensured that his early empire could grow without attracting the unwanted scrutiny that had toppled so many before him. The psychological aspect of these early ventures was equally important. Matteo constantly studied the motivations, fears, and desires of those around him. He learned to anticipate reactions, to subtly steer conversations, and to create situations where others acted in ways that served both their interests and his own. These lessons in human behavior were as critical as the practical skills he applied in his operations. By understanding the underlying currents of loyalty, fear, and ambition, Matteo could navigate complex interactions with grace and precision, ensuring that his early ventures strengthened both his network and his reputation. Through these early experiments, Matteo Ardenti began to understand the essence of control and influence. He discovered that power could be extended without force, that alliances could be nurtured without overt dominance, and that careful observation and patience were often more effective than immediate action. The foundations of his philosophy, discipline, foresight, strategic patience, and subtle influence, were being applied in real-world situations, shaping his early empire brick by brick. As night fell over Milan and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and neon lights, Matteo would often walk alone, reflecting on the day's interactions. Each encounter, each negotiation, each small victory was catalogued in his mind, analyzed for lessons, and stored as part of a growing mental framework for future operations. In the quiet of the city, he understood that true influence was not a matter of coercion, but of strategy, patience, and the quiet cultivation of relationships. By the end of these formative years, Matteo had established not just a presence, but a system. A small, discreet empire had taken shape, one built on intelligence, subtle influence, and careful planning. While others measured power in size, wealth, or notoriety, Matteo's measure was control, knowledge, and resilience. The empire was modest in scope, but it reflected the principles that would define his approach for decades: quiet observation, strategic patience, and the meticulous orchestration of human behavior. It was the beginning of something far greater, a foundation upon which an empire could be built, carefully, deliberately, and with the precision of a thinker who understood that true power often moves silently, unseen, and always calculated. As Matteo Ardenti's influence quietly spread through the quieter corners of Milan, his reputation began to grow, not through displays of force or fear, but through the measured, deliberate exercise of intelligence. By this stage, he was no longer a newcomer testing the waters of the underworld. He had become a figure whose calm presence and subtle authority drew attention, curiosity, and, above all, cautious respect. His rise through the ranks was not meteoric, nor was it flamboyant. It was a steady, almost imperceptible ascent, shaped by foresight, strategy, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the moves of both allies and rivals. To those who observed him from a distance, Matteo seemed almost like a shadow gliding through the streets, influencing events without leaving visible traces, guiding outcomes without ever appearing to interfere. The foundation of his rising influence was his unique approach to human behavior. Matteo understood that loyalty was rarely won through intimidation alone and that power could be extended far more effectively through subtle guidance, quiet observation, and the careful cultivation of trust. He moved among both allies and rivals with an awareness that few possessed, noting patterns, calculating risks, and anticipating reactions before they occurred. Where others saw competition and potential confrontation, Matteo saw opportunity and strategy, recognizing that the careful orchestration of relationships could achieve more than any act of violence ever could. As his influence expanded, Matteo began to attract the attention of higher-ranking figures within Milan's criminal networks. These were individuals who had long relied on aggression, intimidation, and reputation to maintain their power. At first, many regarded Matteo with skepticism. How could a young man, quiet, cerebral, and seemingly unassuming, navigate a world defined by force and volatility? Yet, those who underestimated him soon found that his subtle intelligence allowed him to anticipate threats, negotiate alliances, and solve problems that others approached with brute force. Slowly, his reputation for calculated precision and strategic patience began to precede him, earning him invitations to meetings, consultations, and even minor positions of authority. Rising through the ranks was not without tension. Matteo often found himself in situations where patience and intellect were tested against the impulsive nature of others. Rival figures sought to assert dominance, testing his resolve and attempting to provoke missteps. Yet Matteo's approach remained consistent. He observed, calculated, and responded only when necessary, carefully weighing each action against potential consequences. This composure became a hallmark of his character, a quiet yet unmistakable signal to those around him that he was not to be rushed or underestimated. His calm authority, exercised without spectacle, earned him both respect and wariness, gradually establishing him as a figure whose influence could not be ignored. A crucial element of Matteo's ascent was his ability to build alliances that were both strategic and resilient. He did not seek blind loyalty or temporary compliance. Instead, he cultivated relationships that were mutually beneficial, rooted in understanding and subtle persuasion. Merchants, small-time operators, and even some higher-ranking figures were drawn into networks where influence flowed quietly but decisively. Matteo's calm demeanor encouraged cooperation without fear, creating a sense of security that allowed others to align with him willingly. In these alliances, he demonstrated a rare skill, the ability to extend power without demanding immediate submission, to guide without overt interference, and to cultivate loyalty through trust rather than intimidation. Simultaneously, Matteo's intellectual approach distinguished him from his peers. While others relied on reputation or brute force, he relied on foresight, analysis, and careful planning. He maintained detailed mental maps of connections, observing subtle shifts in alliances and rivalries, noting which individuals could be influenced, and which posed potential threats. He used this knowledge to orchestrate outcomes subtly, resolving conflicts before they escalated and positioning himself advantageously in situations where others might have acted impulsively. In effect, his rise was as much a product of psychological insight as it was of operational skill, a steady accumulation of influence built on careful understanding of human behavior. Even as he advanced, Matteo remained attentive to the optics of his actions. He understood that visibility could invite both opportunity and danger, and he managed his presence with deliberate discretion. Meetings were conducted in quiet, unremarkable locations, transactions were negotiated without spectacle, and influence was extended through careful channels rather than overt displays of power. This approach minimized unnecessary attention while maximizing strategic advantage, allowing him to consolidate authority without provoking resentment or unnecessary conflict. His reputation for calm, effective leadership spread quietly, establishing him as a figure whose intelligence was as formidable as any physical force in the city. Challenges continued to arise, as they inevitably would in a world governed by shifting loyalties and competing ambitions. Rivals attempted to test him, probing for weaknesses, while law enforcement increased scrutiny on emerging figures. Matteo navigated these pressures with his characteristic blend of patience and strategy. He relied on observation, forethought, and subtle intervention rather than rash action, ensuring that his ascent remained steady, sustainable, and largely insulated from the volatility that had undone others. Each challenge was a lesson, each confrontation an opportunity to refine his approach, and each success a step further along the path of quiet authority. A defining aspect of Matteo's rise was his ability to blend practical acumen with philosophical reflection. Even amidst the complexities of alliances, negotiations, and power dynamics, he maintained a contemplative approach, continually analyzing outcomes, motivations, and potential future scenarios. He saw the underworld not merely as a series of transactions or battles, but as a living system, one that could be navigated with strategy, intellect, and patience. This perspective allowed him to operate several steps ahead of peers who relied solely on reaction, intuition, or aggression, further solidifying his position and reputation. By the time Matteo had established himself as a rising figure, his influence had begun to extend beyond immediate neighborhoods and minor networks. Small operations, strategic alliances, and carefully nurtured relationships had combined to create a foundation that was both robust and adaptable. His peers began to recognize that he possessed an unusual combination of intelligence, composure, and strategic insight, qualities that allowed him to rise without the need for overt violence or reckless displays of authority. In this way, Matteo's ascent exemplified a different kind of power, one built not on fear or spectacle but on knowledge, observation, and the patient cultivation of influence. Even in quiet moments, as Matteo walked the streets of Milan observing the ebb and flow of the city, he reflected on his position, the dynamics of loyalty, and the opportunities that lay ahead. The streets themselves seemed to respond to his presence, not with overt acknowledgement, but with subtle shifts, small indications that his influence was taking root. Each interaction, each alliance, and each carefully calculated move strengthened the foundations of a rising empire, an empire not yet fully visible, yet already shaping the rhythms and loyalties of the city. Through these early stages of his rise, Matteo Ardenti demonstrated a rare and powerful truth, that intelligence, patience, and strategic observation could achieve more lasting authority than force alone. He moved steadily, deliberately, and with the calm precision of a thinker fully aware of the stakes. His rise through the ranks was a quiet symphony of calculation and subtle influence, a careful orchestration of relationships, strategy, and foresight that set him apart from his contemporaries and laid the groundwork for the empire he was destined to command. As Matteo Ardenti's influence in Milan grew, he began to recognize that sustaining power required more than clever alliances, subtle negotiation, and strategic foresight. It required structure, discipline, and a system that could endure beyond the fleeting loyalty of individuals. It was during this phase of his rise that he conceived the concept that would later define much of his empire: operations contained within controlled, bounded territories, carefully managed and insulated from unnecessary exposure. These wall-bound operations were not simply a defensive tactic, they were a philosophy of control, a methodical approach to influence that allowed Matteo to extend his reach without overextending, to consolidate authority while minimizing vulnerability. The principle was simple yet profound. By focusing on clearly defined areas, Matteo could maintain oversight, cultivate loyalty, and monitor every interaction within his domain. Each enterprise, each relationship, and each transaction was meticulously observed, evaluated, and guided to ensure that outcomes aligned with his long-term objectives. It was not the size of the territory that mattered, but the completeness of control and the precision of influence exercised within it. In a city as complex and interconnected as Milan, this approach allowed Matteo to achieve a level of authority that rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, those whose power was more visibly expansive but less carefully managed. His first wall-bound operation was modest, a collection of small businesses, informal networks, and trusted intermediaries concentrated within a single district. Here, Matteo could observe activity directly, intervene subtly when necessary, and cultivate relationships that reinforced loyalty and dependence. The operation was designed to be self-sustaining yet responsive, with clear lines of communication and oversight that ensured no element acted independently of the broader system. In essence, Matteo created a microcosm of his philosophy, an ecosystem of influence where every part was carefully balanced, observed, and guided. In practical terms, this approach allowed Matteo to maintain exceptional control over both opportunities and threats. He could detect minor issues before they escalated, address disputes discreetly, and prevent conflicts from spreading beyond the boundaries of his operations. At the same time, the clearly defined perimeter created a sense of security for those within his influence. Allies, intermediaries, and local operators understood that loyalty was valued, that discretion was expected, and that Matteo's oversight ensured stability and continuity. In this environment, trust flourished, not through fear, but through careful management, consistency, and the quiet demonstration of competence. This model also allowed Matteo to experiment with different strategies without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. By containing operations within controlled areas, he could trial new methods, evaluate outcomes, and refine approaches before scaling them more broadly. He tested communication channels, negotiated with emerging players, and implemented systems of accountability that were both subtle and effective. These experiments were never reckless, they were carefully calculated exercises in observation, influence, and adaptive strategy. Over time, Matteo's understanding of this approach deepened, and the wall-bound model became the hallmark of his management style, a philosophy that balanced power, discretion, and long-term sustainability. Central to the success of these operations was Matteo's ability to integrate human behavior into every aspect of management. He observed not only the actions of his associates but their motivations, fears, and ambitions. By anticipating reactions and subtly shaping perceptions, he ensured that loyalty was maintained, conflicts were resolved quietly, and the system functioned as a cohesive whole. This attention to psychology allowed him to operate effectively even in volatile situations, turning potential threats into opportunities for reinforcement of authority. Unlike those who relied on brute force, Matteo's influence was cultivated through understanding, foresight, and subtle manipulation, a quiet power that was nearly invisible but profoundly effective. Matteo also understood the importance of discretion in consolidating power. He avoided public attention, flashy displays of wealth, or overt demonstrations of control. His operations were deliberately low profile, allowing him to extend influence without attracting scrutiny from rivals or law enforcement. Even as his empire expanded, it remained almost invisible to the casual observer. Those within the walls of his operations felt security and stability, while those outside often underestimated the extent of his authority. In this way, Matteo created a dual perception, a figure who appeared unassuming yet whose influence penetrated deeply and decisively. As his wall-bound operations matured, Matteo began to extend the concept to multiple districts. Each area was managed semi-independently, with trusted lieutenants overseeing daily activities under his guidance. While these subordinates exercised some autonomy, Matteo maintained oversight through regular observation, subtle communication, and carefully designed systems of accountability. By decentralizing operations without relinquishing control, he achieved scalability without vulnerability, a delicate balance that many in the criminal world struggled to maintain. This system allowed Matteo to grow his empire steadily, reinforcing loyalty and efficiency while minimizing the risks inherent in rapid expansion. Challenges inevitably arose. Rival operators sought to encroach on his controlled territories, testing the strength of his networks and the loyalty of his associates. Yet Matteo's wall-bound philosophy allowed him to respond calmly and decisively. He did not rely solely on force, he employed observation, negotiation, and subtle realignment of alliances to neutralize threats. By anticipating rival moves and preemptively adjusting his operations, he ensured that his influence remained secure. These confrontations were rarely dramatic, they were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly effective, further cementing his reputation as a strategist whose power lay in foresight and control rather than spectacle. Equally important was Matteo's attention to the morale and motivation of those within his operations. He understood that loyalty was reinforced not by fear alone but by recognition, reward, and subtle affirmation. Associates who performed well received acknowledgement and opportunities for advancement, while those whose loyalty or performance was questionable were observed and managed carefully. This combination of structure, subtle influence, and strategic oversight created an environment in which his empire could function with remarkable efficiency and resilience. Matteo's philosophy emphasized that an operation's success depended not solely on his own actions but on the alignment, competence, and loyalty of every individual within its boundaries. The success of these early wall-bound operations was not immediately visible to outsiders, but the quiet effectiveness of Matteo's system was undeniable to those within his influence. Small disputes were resolved before they escalated, opportunities were seized without unnecessary conflict, and loyalty was cultivated through consistent, thoughtful management. In the years to come, these principles would be applied on a larger scale, forming the backbone of an empire that was resilient, adaptable, and remarkably enduring. Through these carefully constructed operations, Matteo Ardenti demonstrated a rare mastery of both strategy and human behavior. He understood that true authority was less about immediate dominance and more about sustained influence, subtle guidance, and the careful orchestration of relationships. By consolidating power within defined, controlled territories, he created a foundation that allowed for both growth and stability, a balance that would define the distinctive nature of his empire for decades to come. The rivalry did not begin with violence or a dramatic confrontation, but with something far quieter, almost mundane. It started with a single dismissive laugh, a short, sharp sound uttered by a capo named Ruggiero Vantini, a man whose temper was as volatile as his ambition. That laugh, tossed casually into the thick cigarette smoke of a cramped tavern meeting, was the spark that set an invisible fuse burning. Ruggiero, known for his heavy rings and heavier ego, had heard whispers of Matteo Ardenti's rising influence. He had heard how men referred to Matteo as il Filosofo, the philosopher who studied shadows and predicted conflicts like a chess player quietly moving pieces long before anyone else noticed the board. To Ruggiero, it was ridiculous. A man who read books instead of brandishing a blade. To him, Matteo was nothing more than an overrated thinker standing in the wrong business. But while Ruggiero laughed, Matteo simply observed. In his calm, steady way, he watched how the man's fingers drummed on the table, how the muscles in his jaw tightened when discussing territory, how he leaned too far forward when asserting dominance. Matteo knew that kind of man, impulsive, loud, a creature of instinct rather than calculation. These men were dangerous not because they were smart, but because they believed they were invincible. They struck quickly and loudly, always assuming the shock alone would guarantee victory. Matteo's response to the insult was not visible to anyone in the tavern. He made no comment, no retort, not even the faintest hint of insulted pride. Instead, he filed away the moment like a note in one of his leather-bound journals. In Matteo's world, every gesture carried meaning, every word revealed intention, and every enemy declared himself long before he made his move. In the following weeks, tension rippled quietly through the underworld. Ruggiero began acting with greater boldness, pressing into Matteo's routes, intercepting shipments, and trying to lure Matteo's associates with promises of easy money. These acts were not outright declarations of war, but they were provocations, a series of small cuts meant to weaken Matteo's stance. Many expected Matteo to retaliate with force, to send a message drenched in fear and finality. But he did nothing of the sort. Instead, Matteo watched. He tracked patterns, the timing of Ruggiero's moves, the faces of his newest allies, even the types of businesses Ruggiero frequented. He studied the man like a subject in a philosophical inquiry. What drives a person to overestimate himself? What pushes a blade before the mind has caught up? These questions fascinated him, and he believed the answers would shape his next decision. His associates, however, grew restless. Some interpreted Matteo's silence as weakness, a sign that Ruggiero's mockery had unsettled him. Others trusted Matteo's methods but feared that patience might lead to greater danger. In dimly lit back rooms, they whispered about how long they could wait before Ruggiero escalated the conflict beyond recovery. Yet Matteo remained unshaken. He knew that responding too soon would play into the very chaos Ruggiero thrived on. One evening, as rain tapped against the windowpanes of Matteo's study, a courier delivered a message. It was simple, written hastily in smudged ink, reporting that one of Matteo's minor depots had been ransacked. No casualties, but a clear warning. Matteo stared at the note for a long time, the candlelight flickering across his thoughtful gaze. Then he quietly folded the paper and placed it in his journal, marking the page with a red thread. That thread, he knew, would be important later. The next night, Matteo entered the same tavern where the rivalry had begun. He walked in alone, without his usual pair of watchers. His footsteps were soft, almost meditative. Inside, Ruggiero was already there, boasting loudly to a cluster of men who laughed more out of fear than actual amusement. When Matteo approached, Ruggiero's grin widened, stretching with false confidence. He leaned back theatrically, as though expecting Matteo to challenge him, to accuse him, to start the storm everyone anticipated. But Matteo simply sat down. He folded his hands on the table, his posture calm, almost polite. He waited until the laughter around them faded into uncertain quiet. Ruggiero, confused by the lack of confrontation, narrowed his eyes. "You've been busy," Matteo said softly, his tone even and unthreatening. "I've noticed." Ruggiero scoffed. "Someone had to teach you your place." Matteo nodded once, slowly, as though the statement were not an insult but an interesting philosophical viewpoint. For a moment, he seemed lost in reflection. Then he asked a single question, quiet, gentle, but piercing. "Do you understand the difference between strength and exposure?" Ruggiero blinked, clearly caught off guard. His men exchanged uneasy glances. Matteo continued before he could speak. "When a man shouts," Matteo said, "he draws attention. When he moves too quickly, he leaves footprints. And when he underestimates a quiet enemy, he forgets to watch his own back." Ruggiero leaned forward, trying to regain the upper hand. "Is that supposed to scare me?" "No," Matteo replied. "It's meant to warn you." The table fell into absolute stillness. The tavern, once filled with noise, seemed to hold its breath. Matteo rose from his seat, leaving behind no threats, no ultimatums, only a lingering sense of unease. He walked out into the night rain without looking back. Within 48 hours, Ruggiero's operation collapsed, not through bloodshed, but through precise disruptions Matteo had prepared weeks earlier. Matteo had mapped Ruggiero's impatience, predicting exactly how he would overextend himself. Quietly, methodically, Matteo redirected payments, exposed vulnerabilities, and ensured that rival families pounced at the perfect moment. By the time Ruggiero realized what was happening, his support had evaporated. His empire, built on noise and bravado, crumbled under its own weight. And through it all, Matteo never once lifted a weapon. He simply understood his enemy better than the enemy understood himself. The conflict that unfolded after Ruggiero's downfall did not resemble the dramatic street wars that typically punctuated the underworld. Instead, it unfolded like a slow-moving storm, one that built itself quietly on the horizon before anyone realized how many small shifts in the wind were gathering strength. Matteo Ardenti understood this better than anyone. He knew that true battles in the shadows were rarely loud, they were subtle, patient, almost methodical. And so the tension between his network and the rival faction that sought to replace Ruggiero began not with gunfire, but with tiny distortions in routine, shipments delayed by an hour instead of arriving early, coded messages taking longer to return, familiar faces showing unfamiliar caution. It was the kind of conflict Matteo excelled at. He could sense the tremors in the structure before the walls visibly cracked. In the weeks that followed Ruggiero's collapse, a new adversarial organization emerged, one that preferred chaos over method, brute improvisation over planning. Its members believed Matteo's rise had been a fluke, a product of clever luck rather than disciplined foresight. They assumed they could push against him aggressively, provoking reactions, forcing mistakes, turning disorder into advantage. But Matteo did not react. He observed. Most nights during this period, he positioned himself at a small wooden desk in a dimly lit room above an old trattoria, reviewing reports from his scouts. The candle beside him flickered, throwing elongated shadows across the maps pinned to the walls. He traced every disruption with a steady fingertip, noting patterns in the disorder. Each missing crate, each intercepted message, each unusual movement in the markets was marked not as an isolated event but as part of a broader mosaic. Most men looked only at the pieces, Matteo looked at the entire frame. His closest associates met him in quiet intervals, slipping through back alleys to deliver updates. Their whispers mixed with the distant hum of the city settling into night. One brought news of a warehouse break-in where nothing had been stolen, only rearranged. Another reported unfamiliar faces at the edge of their usual trading corners. A third described hearing Matteo's name spoken with a mixture of admiration and contempt in a rival tavern. The underworld was shifting, and Matteo could feel the tremor of a larger intention behind these scattered acts. The rival faction believed unpredictability gave them power. They moved quickly, without rhythm, hoping to force Matteo into the same frantic pace. Yet each rushed strike left traces, hurried decisions, patterns of overreach, trails of desperation. Matteo catalogued them all. He knew that chaos, by its very nature, relied on an assumption, that the opponent would panic. So long as Matteo refused to act out of fear, the chaos would begin turning inward on the very people who created it. One night, while analyzing yet another irregularity, Matteo noticed a curious alignment. Several seemingly unrelated disruptions occurred along a single, narrow trade channel east of the city. At first glance, it looked random. But when he overlaid the times and locations on his map, a delicate chain of misdirection emerged, like footprints circling the same point. He leaned back, contemplating the shape the pattern created. It was not an attack. It was bait. The realization came with a quiet certainty. The rival faction wanted him to reinforce that particular route, to send more men, more goods, more attention, so they could strike hard and fast. A direct ambush. The kind of trap designed for people who acted impulsively. Matteo allowed himself a faint, almost invisible smile. Instead of reinforcing the route, he emptied it. Quietly. Subtly. No announcement, no shift in routine beyond what his closest circle knew. He let the rival faction believe their disruption was working. He let them think Matteo was struggling to keep pace. Meanwhile, he strengthened 3 alternative routes, each hidden under layers of misleading paperwork and coded trails. Every night, under lantern light, he watched the rival faction fall deeper into their own illusion. Days passed. The rival group grew bolder, convinced they were tightening a snare around Matteo. They moved men closer to the ambush point, gathered weapons, prepared vehicles, all under the assumption that Matteo would react in the predictable way they expected from most crime leaders. They saw what they wanted to see. Matteo saw everything else. When the night of the expected ambush arrived, the rival faction lay in wait, crowding the narrow channel with impatient tension. The air was thick with anticipation and arrogance. But the trucks they hoped to intercept never arrived. Only silence greeted them. Minutes turned into an hour. Confusion spread. Whispers grew sharp, irritated. They had prepared for a violent clash, only to be met with emptiness. Then, slowly, the realization must have dawned on them. By gathering their forces here, by concentrating so many men in one place, they had left their own territory thinly defended. Matteo's network didn't strike the waiting ambushers. They struck everywhere else. Not with bullets, but with precision. Records were seized. Meetings were disrupted. Informants were exposed. Safe houses were quietly emptied of their contents. Alliances the rival group relied on dissolved under the weight of subtle persuasion. Commerce they had controlled slipped through Matteo's fingers like sand being poured from one hand into another. The rival group's strength evaporated not through violence, but through structural collapse. By dawn, the faction that had once believed disorder was a weapon found themselves surrounded by the consequences of their own instability. Their leadership fragmented. Their plans unraveled. Their confidence broke apart like glass under slow pressure. Throughout it all, Matteo remained calm, seated once again at his wooden desk as he reviewed the final reports. The candle beside him burned low, its flame steady despite the shifting winds outside. He had not fired a single shot, nor had he needed to. The rival group had defeated themselves, he had only guided the motion. It was a war conducted in slow motion, fought with patience rather than force, with understanding rather than fury. And as word spread through the underworld of how Matteo emerged unscathed while his enemies collapsed, a new respect, tinged with fear, settled over his name. Those who had doubted him now understood the truth. Chaos could shake a man, but it could never shake one who had already studied every tremor it produced. Matteo Ardenti's empire did not flourish solely because of strategy or intellect, it endured because it was governed by a set of principles, quiet, rigid, and almost philosophical in nature. These rules were not carved into stone or whispered ceremonially at secret gatherings. Instead, they were lived, observed, reinforced through consistency. Anyone who entered Matteo's inner circle quickly realized that the organization was less like a typical criminal network and more like a disciplined order, held together by ideas rather than fear. Matteo believed that without structure, even the most powerful organizations would rot from within. And so he introduced what he privately called his creed. The first rule was deceptively simple: unnecessary violence was forbidden. In an underworld defined by threats and retaliation, this principle stood out like a calm stream running through a battlefield. To Matteo, violence was a failure of foresight, evidence that a situation had been allowed to reach chaos. He believed every conflict could be redirected long before the need for force emerged. His lieutenants learned to negotiate with patience, to listen more than they spoke, and to understand motivations before acting upon them. Those who came from bloodier traditions initially resisted, but over time they saw the wisdom. Violence drew eyes, and attention was the enemy of longevity. The empire grew stronger in silence, not spectacle. Another rule demanded emotional restraint. Matteo was convinced that anger and pride were the two weaknesses most often exploited. He trained his inner circle to respond to provocation with composure. Meetings often included quiet exercises, a man reporting a loss without raising his voice, another describing an insult without clenching his fists. Matteo insisted that clarity of mind was more powerful than sharp steel. To him, emotional discipline was not just strength, it was survival. Many found this uncomfortable at first. The underworld thrived on displays of dominance, and to remain calm in the face of insult seemed counterintuitive. Yet Matteo proved repeatedly that the ability to remain still while others raged provided an advantage no weapon could match. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of Matteo's creed involved writing. Every lieutenant was required to keep a journal. It was not optional, nor symbolic. Matteo believed that writing sharpened perception, forced reflection, and prevented impulsive action. He instructed them to record incidents, decisions, doubts, and victories with equal honesty. In dimly lit rooms across the city, hardened men who once scoffed at literacy now found themselves writing by candlelight, documenting patterns, emotions, and consequences they had never bothered to examine before. Some deeply disliked the practice, but Matteo insisted on it because he knew that self-awareness was a rare and powerful tool in a world full of blind ambition. Matteo led by example. His own journals were meticulous collections of observations, philosophical commentary, and cold, strategic calculations. He often wrote late into the night, the soft scratching of his pen blending with the faint creak of the old wooden chair beneath him. Those who glimpsed his pages saw a mind both analytic and introspective. He wrote not as a criminal boss, but as a scholar dissecting the nature of power. In his eyes, every decision deserved study, every betrayal, every alliance, every silence. He believed that understanding one's own patterns prevented others from exploiting them. His rules extended into how operations were conducted as well. No one was permitted to take action without understanding the broader implications. Matteo encouraged questions: why are we doing this? What does this achieve? Who benefits besides us? In many organizations, questioning leadership was seen as insolence. Matteo saw it as essential. He wanted thinkers, not drones. Obedience without comprehension was dangerous, because it produced men who acted blindly in ways that jeopardized everything. His empire functioned like a well-tuned machine, driven by analysis rather than impulse. However, the rigidity of the creed also created tension. The underworld was not designed for intellectual discipline. Some men felt constrained, as though Matteo's rules tightened around them like invisible chains. They longed for the old ways: quick retaliation, overt displays of strength, the intoxicating rush of decisive violence. Matteo understood their frustration but refused to compromise. His rules were not suggestions, they were the spine of the empire. Without them, he believed everything he built would collapse under greed, fear, or recklessness. Yet for all its order, the creed carried an inherent vulnerability. It depended on consistency and loyalty, two things notoriously fragile among criminals. As Matteo's influence grew, so did the number of men who admired his methods but lacked the discipline to uphold them. Some followed the rules only in his presence. Others kept journals but filled them with lies. A few performed emotional restraint like actors, masking impulses they had no intention of controlling. Matteo recognized these cracks forming. He could see the ways his principles strained against the chaotic nature of the life he had chosen. Still, he held firm, believing that abandoning the creed would unravel everything. Even among his trusted inner circle, subtle conflicts emerged. Some lieutenants quietly questioned whether Matteo's refusal to employ fear as a weapon left them vulnerable to more brutal rivals. They worried that restraint would be mistaken for weakness. Matteo reassured them with logic, explaining that fear produced obedience but not loyalty, and obedience without loyalty was fragile. Yet doubts lingered beneath the surface like embers waiting to ignite. As the empire expanded, the creed took on a mythic quality. People whispered that Matteo could predict betrayal before it happened, that his journals contained insights into the minds of every man around him. His insistence on discipline created an aura of mystery. Outsiders viewed his organization as something almost ceremonial, its members calm even in crisis, its leader unreadably serene. This mystique protected Matteo in ways violence never could. Men hesitated to confront what they could not understand. But the world outside Matteo's carefully designed system was shifting. New players arrived with new methods, some cunning, others reckless, many indifferent to the quiet order Matteo imposed. His rules were strong, but they were rigid, and rigid systems, no matter how well constructed, can strain under pressure. Matteo sensed the tension growing, the quiet friction where belief met reality. His empire depended on people upholding the creed, yet people remained unpredictable. Structure could guide them, but it could not change their nature entirely. Still, Matteo clung to his principles. He believed that rules defined a man more than victories did. And so he continued writing each night, continued teaching discipline, continued shaping an empire grounded not in fear but in thought. In the dim glow of candlelight, surrounded by maps and journals, he remained convinced that structure would prevail over chaos, if only he could keep the fractures from spreading too far, too fast. Even the most disciplined mind can be tested by the shadows it cannot control, and for Matteo Ardenti, the subtle cracks of paranoia began to appear in the quiet moments of his empire. It started imperceptibly, almost like a faint vibration beneath the stones of the old city walls he had so carefully claimed. He noticed small inconsistencies, a ledger entry that didn't align perfectly, a courier who lingered a fraction longer than usual, a trusted associate whose gaze seemed to shift when certain names were mentioned. Each anomaly was slight, almost dismissible, yet Matteo's mind, trained to see patterns and predict outcomes, could not ignore them. What most men would have brushed aside as coincidence or fatigue, he catalogued meticulously, each observation adding to a growing constellation of suspicion. At first, he regarded these signs with curiosity rather than fear. His empire had grown so quietly, so methodically, that he trusted in his own systems. He believed that his rules, his creed, and the loyalty of those who had been carefully selected would protect him. But as the discrepancies multiplied, the comfort of control began to erode. Matteo felt a subtle tension coil in his chest, a quiet reminder that the underworld never operated solely on reason. It operated on impulse, greed, and fear. Even a single lapse could unravel everything he had painstakingly constructed. Matteo began to spend longer hours alone in the stone-walled rooms of his network, reviewing journals, maps, and coded communications. The candlelight flickered against the walls as he retraced the movements of his associates and the routes of shipments. Each night, he reconstructed the operations in his mind, searching for deviations that might indicate betrayal or oversight. His practice, once meditative, began to take on a more urgent quality. The careful study of human behavior, which had always been a source of strength, now revealed every imperfection, every hesitation, every trace of deception. Sleep became intermittent. Matteo found himself waking at odd hours, straining to remember the details of transactions that had occurred days earlier. He would replay conversations in his mind, noting the tone, the cadence, the words chosen, or avoided. Was the emphasis on a single word a clue? Was a pause a confession disguised as hesitation? Every nuance became a potential sign of danger. The quiet observation that had once been his shield now bordered on obsession. Still, he refused to confront anyone prematurely. The strength of his empire lay in patience, and even paranoia required strategy. His closest confidants noticed the change. Matteo's calm demeanor, once unshakable, now carried an edge of intensity. Meetings grew longer, with more questions than ever before. Lieutenants found themselves explaining routines in excruciating detail, repeating information they had previously thought unnecessary. Matteo asked about everything: shipments, communications, alliances, even minor gestures by seemingly insignificant associates. Each query, though delivered with gentle politeness, carried the weight of judgment. Silence was not merely stillness, it was a lens through which loyalty could be examined and vulnerabilities detected. Yet, paradoxically, Matteo's heightened vigilance strengthened the empire in some ways. Associates were more careful in their actions, communication became more precise, and errors that might have gone unnoticed were now corrected before they could escalate. Matteo's paranoia acted as an invisible guide, a subtle pressure ensuring that everyone maintained the discipline he demanded. It was a delicate balance: too much suspicion could fracture relationships, too little could invite disaster. He walked the fine line with meticulous care, aware that every decision could ripple through the network like stones dropped into water. Even in the solitude of his study, Matteo wrestled with the psychological toll of this vigilance. He understood that the mind, when fixated on potential threats, can become a trap of its own making. He forced himself to step back, to consider probabilities rather than certainties, and to weigh evidence without letting fear dictate interpretation. The walls of the stone rooms, once protective, now seemed to echo with imagined whispers. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant call of a night bird, the rustle of a courier outside, took on the weight of possible betrayal. Yet he remained calm on the surface, projecting the serenity that had always defined him, even as his inner world churned with questions. Matteo also began to examine the psychological patterns of those around him with a new intensity. He studied subtle changes in behavior, who avoided eye contact, who lingered too long over trivial matters, who seemed unusually eager to volunteer information. His understanding of human behavior, honed over years of observation, became almost forensic. He created mental profiles, anticipating potential threats and calculating the likelihood of deception. Each new insight added to his strategic map, allowing him to preempt errors and potential sabotage before they could manifest in reality. As the sense of threat grew, Matteo turned his attention to the structural integrity of the empire itself. He re-evaluated routes, reinforced redundancies, and introduced minor alterations in procedures to test the loyalty and attentiveness of his associates. Small, controlled changes became a diagnostic tool. Observing how individuals adapted, or failed to adapt, revealed their reliability and the likelihood of disloyalty. Matteo's network functioned like a living organism, and he, as always, remained both observer and tactician, ensuring that the smallest disruptions could be addressed before they threatened the larger system. Yet for all the discipline and foresight, Matteo could not fully escape the human element. Fear is contagious, and even the most rational mind can be swayed by imagination when alone in darkness. There were nights when he lay awake, tracing the outlines of threats that might not exist, imagining conspiracies that were only shadows. Still, he accepted this tension as part of his role. Awareness of vulnerability was necessary for survival, and even paranoia, if managed carefully, could be transformed into strategic advantage. It was a quiet tension that both sharpened and burdened him, a reminder that vigilance was inseparable from leadership in the underworld. Despite these pressures, Matteo never abandoned his guiding principles. He continued to uphold his creed, emphasizing discipline, patience, and observation over impulsive reaction. He encouraged journaling, reflection, and calm assessment even as he scrutinized every movement within the empire. In this way, his paranoia became a tool rather than a weakness. It allowed him to anticipate threats with greater precision, to respond before problems escalated, and to maintain control over a network that could easily spiral into chaos without constant attention. By the time the first whispers of betrayal emerged in the ledger entries, Matteo was already prepared. He had traced every deviation, assessed every risk, and created contingencies for potential disruption. The paranoia that might have paralyzed a lesser man instead allowed him to act decisively, preemptively, and with remarkable subtlety. Every step he took was deliberate, every intervention calculated to restore balance without provoking alarm. The walls of his empire, both literal and figurative, remained intact, a testament to the disciplined mind that understood the thin line between vigilance and obsession. And yet, Matteo knew that the battle was not only against external rivals or traitors but against the tendencies of his own mind. He understood that overextension of suspicion could weaken trust and undermine cohesion. The challenge was to maintain the delicate equilibrium between awareness and fear, between preparation and obsession. Night after night, he walked this line, guided by logic, intuition, and the quiet knowledge that only by understanding the full spectrum of human behavior, strengths, flaws, and hidden intentions, could his empire endure. The years that followed Matteo Ardenti's tightening grip on his network were marked by both triumph and internal tension, the quiet hum of success interspersed with sharp moments of doubt. His empire, once a quiet undercurrent in the bustling world of organized crime, was now undeniably powerful, its roots deeply embedded in the city's streets and in the underworld's vast, shadowy trade routes. But the more secure his hold seemed, the more Matteo's paranoia whispered that something was inevitably going to unravel. Success, as he knew all too well, bred its own kind of vulnerability, exposure to betrayal, the insidious spread of distrust, and the constant threat of the law catching up. Matteo's internal conflict became more palpable over time. He could no longer enjoy the peace of watching his empire operate like a well-oiled machine without hearing the faintest echoes of doubt in his mind. The same meticulous attention to detail that had once been his greatest strength now felt like a burden. The weight of responsibility began to gnaw at him, and though he had always prided himself on his ability to detach from emotion, the quiet hum of paranoia became harder to ignore. He found himself questioning not only the loyalty of his closest associates but even his own decisions. Were his strategies still sound, or was he overthinking, allowing his own fear to lead him down a path of caution so tight it risked strangling the very thing he had built? Each day, Matteo walked the line between mastery and obsession, between leadership and the creeping fear that someone, somewhere, might slip through the cracks. It wasn't just the visible enemies that worried him, the rival gangs, the law enforcement officers who were always one step behind. It was the silent fractures in his own ranks. People who had worked for him for years, who had proven their loyalty in countless ways, began to act differently. It wasn't anything overt or easily noticeable, but small things caught Matteo's attention: an uncharacteristic delay in a report, a whispered conversation he overheard by chance, a colleague who seemed unusually nervous when asked a simple question. He didn't trust himself to let these things go. His mind, so accustomed to seeing patterns, now read too much into every glance, every hesitation. In response, he became even more calculating. Where before he had been measured and deliberate, now his scrutiny took on a sharper edge. He began to place people in positions where he could observe them more closely, to test their reactions under pressure, to create circumstances where he could measure their true loyalty. His own actions became a chess game, and every pawn, every move, every strategy was part of a larger plan to ensure that no betrayal could be allowed to flourish. The empire itself, though outwardly untouched, was beginning to show signs of strain. Matteo's demand for perfection began to seep into every corner of his organization. His lieutenants, once proud to work for him, now whispered among themselves about his increasing distance and the strange new rituals he imposed on them. They had once believed in Matteo's vision, his cool-headed wisdom, his unshakable control over the ever-turbulent currents of crime, but now they were beginning to wonder if the man they had once admired had begun to lose touch with reality. His need for constant verification and the subtle erosion of trust among his closest associates were slowly creating an atmosphere of unease. Matteo's unyielding discipline had given way to something darker, something that no longer felt like the sure hand of leadership but like the iron grip of a ruler slowly descending into madness. Yet, paradoxically, his enemies, sensing only a fraction of the unraveling within, miscalculated. The external threats that had once seemed so daunting began to underestimate Matteo's continued influence. They saw his empire as weak, distracted by internal strife, and they began to strike harder, pushing for what they believed was a moment of vulnerability. What they failed to understand was that Matteo, despite the mounting pressure within, had anticipated their every move. He had planned for these very kinds of miscalculations. His paranoia, now honed into a sharp tool, allowed him to respond to these threats with a precision that they could not fathom. The rival factions that attempted to capitalize on what they perceived as his weakness were met with calculated retaliation. Matteo's network, though fractured by his growing mistrust, was still far more organized and far-reaching than any of his competitors realized. His lieutenants, those who had remained loyal, executed his plans with ruthless efficiency. Where Matteo had once been the quiet observer, now he was an active force in the shadows, carefully directing the operations, pulling the strings with surgical precision. The fractures within his empire, though real, only made it more resilient, like a cracked stone that could hold together because it had been carefully reinforced in unseen ways. But as much as his empire remained strong in the face of external threats, the personal toll on Matteo grew. He found himself retreating further into isolation. The very people who had once been his closest allies began to seem like strangers. His trusted lieutenants, the ones who had worked by his side through countless operations, now appeared as shadows of their former selves. They carried the same weight of suspicion that had begun to suffocate Matteo, each move scrutinized, each word twisted by doubt. The man who had built his empire on intellect and observation now felt isolated by the very skills that had once given him strength. His empire, once a source of power and pride, now seemed like a labyrinth of mistrust and quiet desperation. In the quiet of his office, late at night, Matteo would often sit at his desk, staring at the flickering candlelight, the faint shadows dancing against the stone walls. His mind would race through the countless decisions he had made, trying to piece together the path that had led him here. Had he made the right choices? Was it inevitable that the tension between loyalty and suspicion would fracture the very network he had worked so hard to build? He wondered if the empire he had created was now a gilded cage, one that trapped him as much as it protected him. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. He would close his eyes, hoping for a brief escape from the constant pressure, but even in the darkness, the doubts would follow him, relentless and suffocating. And yet, despite it all, Matteo could not let go. The empire, with all its fractures and tensions, was his creation. He had fought too long and too hard to see it crumble. The paranoia, the isolation, the suspicion, they had become part of him, inextricably linked to the empire he had built. As much as the internal strife threatened to tear everything apart, Matteo remained determined to hold on. His mind, once sharp and calculated, had now become a double-edged sword, both his greatest asset and his most crippling weakness. The empire was no longer a reflection of his intellect alone, it had become a mirror of his internal struggle, a reflection of a man at war with his own fears and desires. As the years dragged on, Matteo's once unshakable calm began to slip, and with it, his grip on the empire he had painstakingly constructed. The walls he had built around himself, both physical and psychological, began to show signs of wear. He could no longer deny the changes that had occurred within him. The very mind that had once driven him to achieve greatness now became a prison, an inescapable web of thoughts and doubts that tangled him further with each passing day. The paranoia that had once been his strength had evolved into something darker, more consuming. It was no longer just the possibility of betrayal that kept him awake at night, but the terrifying thought that perhaps his fears were becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. He began to withdraw from the world around him, pulling back from his lieutenants, from his trusted advisors, and even from the day-to-day operations that had once defined his role as the head of the empire. No longer did he sit at the table with his closest associates, orchestrating plans and making decisions with ease. Now, he spent more time alone, immersed in his thoughts, his suspicions growing with every passing moment. The once vibrant pulse of the empire, the network of people and systems that had propelled him to the top, seemed to be fading into the background as Matteo's obsession with control consumed him. It wasn't that he had lost confidence in his empire, he still believed in it deeply, but he had lost faith in those who had helped him build it. Matteo began to question the loyalty of everyone around him, even the people who had been with him from the very beginning. The men and women who had once been his closest confidants, the ones who had followed his every command without question, were now viewed with suspicion. Every glance, every gesture, every small hesitation was analyzed with excruciating detail. Matteo's mind, once a tool of clarity and insight, had now become a labyrinth of fear and doubt, a place where even the smallest misstep could trigger a cascade of consequences. The tension within him was unbearable, and yet, he could not stop it. He could not stop seeing betrayal where there was none. He could not stop hearing whispers in the corners of his mind. Despite his growing isolation, Matteo's control over his empire remained impressive. He had created a vast network that was both resilient and adaptable, one that could weather even the most unpredictable storms. His lieutenants, though nervous about the change in his behavior, continued to follow his directives. They carried out operations, managed resources, and ensured that the empire remained functional, even as its leader drifted further into the shadows. The empire, it seemed, was more than just Matteo now, it had become a living entity, one that could function without him, if only for a time. But Matteo knew better than anyone that an empire without its king was an empire on the brink of collapse. He could sense the cracks forming, even if no one else could see them. With every passing day, the paranoia grew more intense, and Matteo's need for control became more absolute. He began to implement stricter measures, ensuring that his orders were followed without question, that no detail was overlooked. Even the most loyal of his subordinates were not exempt from scrutiny. Matteo took to sending his most trusted men on small, seemingly inconsequential missions, not for the sake of the mission itself, but to observe their behavior, to test their resolve. He began to assess their reactions, to see if they could be trusted to follow orders without hesitation. These tests, subtle but effective, were his way of ensuring that no one could slip through the cracks. But the more he tested, the more he began to question his own judgment. His mind, once sharp and clear, now felt like a fog that clouded his every thought. Was he seeing betrayal where there was none? Were his doubts unfounded, the product of an overactive imagination? Or were they the last remnants of a man who had seen too much, who had fought for too long, and who now saw the world around him as a series of threats waiting to strike? Matteo could no longer trust his own instincts. What had once been his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. And yet, despite all of this, he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go of the empire he had built, the empire that had become his entire identity. It was everything he had ever known, everything he had worked for. If he allowed it to slip away, what would be left of him? What would be left of the man who had risen from the shadows to become the most powerful figure in the underworld? The fear of losing control, of losing everything he had worked so hard to build, became the driving force behind every decision he made. As the years passed, Matteo's sense of isolation deepened. He found himself surrounded by people, yet feeling more alone than ever. The very empire he had created, the network of people and power that had once felt like an extension of himself, now seemed like an alien landscape. He was a stranger in his own world, disconnected from the very thing he had devoted his life to. The men and women who once looked up to him now seemed like faceless figures, each one a potential threat lurking in the shadows. Matteo's paranoia had transformed him into a man who could no longer trust his own people, and in turn, he could no longer trust himself. The once determined leader who had guided his empire with purpose and clarity now found himself second-guessing every move. The fear that had once served him as a protective instinct had become a monster that haunted his every waking moment. It gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a state of uncertainty that he could not escape. The sense of power that had once been so intoxicating now felt like a burden, a weight that he could no longer carry. Matteo had become a man trapped within his own creation, a prisoner of the very empire he had built. And yet, despite all of this, he still held on. He held on to the belief that he could control it, that he could bring the empire back into balance, even as everything around him seemed to fall apart. He would not let go. He would not surrender. Matteo was determined to keep the walls from crumbling, to ensure that the empire he had built would survive, even if it meant losing everything else. He had sacrificed too much to let it slip away. So, he clung to it, his legacy, his kingdom, his empire, even as the cracks grew deeper, and the weight of it all threatened to crush him. In the end, it wasn't just the external threats that Matteo had to contend with. It was the war within himself, the battle between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. And though he couldn't stop the inevitable unraveling, Matteo would go down fighting, convinced that, somehow, somewhere, he could still find a way to hold everything together. The empire was his creation, his pride, his life. And though it was slipping through his fingers, Matteo refused to let it go without a fight. The days turned into months, and Matteo's descent into isolation deepened. The empire he had once ruled with the precision of a chess master now seemed like a labyrinth, one that he could no longer navigate with confidence. The loyalty of his subordinates, once unquestionable, was now a source of constant anxiety. Each face in his organization was a mask, and behind each mask, Matteo imagined the possibility of betrayal. His once sharp instincts had dulled, clouded by fear and doubt, and he found himself second-guessing every move, every word. The empire, which had been built on a foundation of trust and respect, now felt fragile, held together only by the thinnest threads of his own paranoia. The whispers around him grew louder, though they were never spoken aloud. They echoed in his mind, the soft rustling of discontent and suspicion, and it was as though the empire itself was conspiring against him. There was a time when Matteo would have been able to dismiss such doubts, to dismiss the murmurs of insecurity. But now, they had taken root in his soul, feeding on his every fear. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of his position as both king and prisoner becoming too much to bear. The empire was his prison, and his obsession with control had become the chains that bound him. What had begun as a strategic retreat from the world had slowly transformed into a full-scale withdrawal from reality. Matteo stopped attending meetings, stopped interacting with his lieutenants, stopped looking his closest associates in the eye. He shut himself away in his private offices, surrounded by papers, plans, and reports that no longer seemed to matter. In his mind, the empire had become a game of survival, and every step, every action, had to be calculated. His mind, once a source of clarity and vision, was now consumed by the ever-present fear that he was losing everything. The empire was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. What made it worse was that Matteo could no longer tell if his fears were justified or if they were the result of his own mental unraveling. Had his empire really begun to decay, or was it simply his mind playing tricks on him? He questioned the motives of his closest men, the ones who had stood by him through thick and thin. His own inner turmoil had begun to infect the very core of the empire he had worked so tirelessly to build. He became obsessed with finding betrayal, but the more he searched, the more he became convinced that he was the only one betraying himself. The lines between reality and paranoia blurred, and Matteo was trapped in a psychological battle with no clear victor in sight. The isolation that Matteo had sought out began to take its toll on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The loneliness, which he had once seen as a refuge, had become a suffocating force. He longed for the connection he had once shared with his men, for the camaraderie that had defined his rise to power. But now, every word, every gesture, seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a subtext of betrayal that he could no longer ignore. The more he distanced himself from those around him, the more disconnected he became from the world he had once controlled. The empire, once a well-oiled machine, was now a shadow of its former self. But even in the midst of this mental and emotional decline, Matteo refused to let go of his reign. He would not allow himself to be toppled, not after all he had accomplished. The fear of losing his power, of watching his empire crumble, was more terrifying to him than anything else. He had given everything for this empire, his youth, his energy, his soul, and he could not, would not, allow it to fall apart. Despite the cracks that were forming in his leadership, despite the growing unrest among his lieutenants, Matteo clung to the belief that he could still control it. He saw himself as the last line of defense against the collapse of his empire, the one man who could hold everything together. But the more he held on, the more it slipped away. The men who had once been his most trusted allies began to notice the changes in Matteo. They saw his increasing withdrawal, his growing paranoia, and his erratic decision-making. Some of them tried to reach out, to remind him of the man he had once been, but Matteo shut them out, convinced that they were only trying to undermine him. He could no longer tell who was truly loyal and who was simply biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The empire he had built, the network of power and influence that had once been so solid, was now a fractured and unstable entity, held together only by the thinnest of threads. Yet, even as Matteo's grip on the empire loosened, he refused to acknowledge the possibility of failure. He refused to believe that his paranoia had led him down a path from which there was no return. The idea that he could be replaced, that his empire could be overtaken by forces outside of his control, was too much for him to bear. And so, he doubled down. He tightened his control over every aspect of the operation, watching his men with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His actions became more unpredictable, his decisions more erratic. He was no longer the calm, calculating leader who had once risen to power through sheer force of will. He was a man in crisis, trying desperately to hold on to the last remnants of his empire. The more he tried to maintain control, the more the empire began to resist. The cracks in the foundation grew wider, and the men who had once followed him without question began to question him. Matteo's increasing isolation pushed them away, creating a distance that could not be bridged. The loyalty that had once been the bedrock of his empire now seemed fragile, as though it were built on sand instead of stone. And in the silence of his office, Matteo could feel it, the walls closing in on him, the weight of his own decisions pressing down harder with each passing day. He was losing his grip, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop it. Still, he refused to acknowledge the truth. He refused to see that his empire, the very thing he had built from the ground up, was crumbling beneath him. The walls that had once been his source of protection had become his prison, and Matteo had locked himself inside. His refusal to confront the reality of his situation was his ultimate undoing. The very strength that had carried him to the top, his ability to control and manipulate, was now the force that tore him apart. And so, Matteo found himself trapped in a vicious cycle, a man consumed by the very empire he had created, unable to escape the walls that surrounded him. In the end, it was not the enemies on the outside that brought him down. It was the battle within, the internal collapse that had been slowly eating away at him for years. The empire, once a symbol of power and control, had become a reflection of his own fears and insecurities. And as Matteo's mental state deteriorated, so too did the empire he had built. His refusal to let go, to accept that things had changed, sealed his fate. In his quest to maintain control, he lost everything. Matteo's descent had not gone unnoticed by those around him. While he had retreated further into himself, his empire, though still operational, was beginning to show signs of wear. His lieutenants, those who had once been loyal to him with a fierce devotion, were now whispering in corners, speaking in hushed tones about their leader's mental state. They had witnessed his increasing detachment, his erratic behavior, and the unnerving changes in his decision-making. What once seemed like a well-oiled machine now appeared to be a house of cards, fragile and easily toppled. But despite all this, they continued to serve him. Perhaps it was out of fear, or perhaps it was because they still believed in him, despite his growing unpredictability. But Matteo could feel it, the shifting air, the growing distance between himself and his once loyal followers. He could sense their unease, even if they hid it behind polite smiles and the outward gestures of respect. The connection that had once been so strong now felt like an illusion, a thin veneer that was starting to crack. There were moments when he would look into the eyes of his closest men and feel a chill, a sense that something was amiss. His paranoia, which had been a tool to keep him vigilant, now became a self-fulfilling prophecy, poisoning every relationship he had built over the years. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of his own downfall, Matteo could not bring himself to confront the truth. His pride, the same pride that had driven him to the top, refused to allow him to acknowledge his weakness. The empire was still his, in his mind, and he would do whatever it took to maintain that grip, even if it meant destroying himself in the process. He had come too far to let it all slip away. The deeper Matteo spiraled, the more his empire seemed to slip from his grasp. His operations became disjointed, and the men who had once carried out his orders with military precision now hesitated. The cracks in the facade were becoming harder to ignore. The network of loyalty he had built over the years was now riddled with suspicion, and his once vibrant empire felt like a decaying relic. Still, Matteo clung to his belief that he could turn things around, that he could restore the empire to its former glory. But the harder he tried to grasp control, the more it seemed to slip away. The walls that he had once used to protect himself were now closing in, trapping him in a prison of his own making. Matteo's isolation grew deeper as his mental state deteriorated. He stopped seeking advice from his trusted lieutenants, no longer bothering to engage in the strategic discussions that had once fueled the empire's expansion. What had once been a thriving, dynamic organization now felt like a hollow shell. His world was reduced to his office, his thoughts, and the endless loop of suspicion that twisted his every move. Every knock on his door, every phone call, every whispered conversation in the halls of his estate became a source of anxiety. What if it was the first sign of betrayal? What if someone was coming to take his place? His mind was consumed by the fear that he could no longer trust anyone, not even himself. It was during these long, sleepless nights that Matteo began to reflect on his rise to power. He thought back to the man he had once been, the young gangster who had used his wits and charisma to claw his way to the top. That man had been sharp, confident, and ruthless. He had never questioned his own ability to outthink his rivals, to stay one step ahead of the law, and to control every facet of his empire. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. The very traits that had made him successful, his cunning, his decisiveness, his ambition, had become distorted. What had once been the foundation of his empire was now the cause of its decay. He had built an empire on the belief that he could control everything, but in the end, it was the illusion of control that had destroyed him. In his isolation, Matteo began to question whether the empire was even worth saving. He had sacrificed so much for it, his family, his friends, his peace of mind, and now it was crumbling before his eyes. Was it really worth it? Had the price been too high? The question lingered in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to answer it. His pride, his ego, and his fear of failure all combined to create a vortex that pulled him deeper into despair. He could not accept that he had lost. Not yet. Not after everything he had been through. Matteo's behavior became more erratic as his inner turmoil intensified. The once calm and collected man who had ruled his empire with an iron fist was now a shell of his former self. He would lash out at those around him for the smallest perceived offense, his temper quick to flare and just as quickly extinguished by the overwhelming guilt that followed. It was as though his mind was constantly at war with itself, one part of him screaming for control, while the other part was quietly conceding that it was all slipping away. And in these moments of fury, Matteo could almost see his empire dissolving, like smoke escaping his grasp. Despite his deteriorating state, Matteo still held on to the belief that he could restore order. But the question remained, could he? His men were no longer loyal in the way they had once been. They were wary, unsure of what their leader had become. Matteo was no longer the man they had followed. He had become something different, a man consumed by his own paranoia and fear, a man who could no longer separate the real threats from the ones in his mind. The foundation of loyalty that had once held his empire together had cracked, and the empire itself seemed to be crumbling along with it. And then, as if to drive home the point, came the first real signs of disloyalty, subtle at first, but undeniable. His trusted lieutenants, the very men who had helped him build his empire, began to make moves of their own. They no longer sought his approval for every decision, and whispers of dissatisfaction began to leak through the cracks. Matteo, still in his isolated state, could not bring himself to confront these signs. He refused to see the truth, even when it was right in front of him. His paranoia, his fear of losing control, blinded him to the reality of the situation. And so, the empire that he had worked so hard to build, the empire that had once been a testament to his power and intellect, began to unravel from within. And Matteo, unable to face the truth, continued to spiral deeper into his own mind. In those final days, Matteo was no longer the feared and respected figure who had once ruled with an iron grip. He had become a ghost of his former self, a man trapped by his own fears, clinging desperately to an empire that was slowly slipping through his fingers. The walls that he had built to protect himself had become his prison, and there was no escape. The empire he had once controlled was now a mere shadow, a fading memory of a time when he had been at the height of his power. And as the final cracks appeared, Matteo could only watch as everything he had worked for began to fade into oblivion. The final years of Matteo's reign were marked by a profound disillusionment, a growing sense that the world he had crafted was no longer the one he recognized. Once a towering figure in the underworld, he had become a man haunted by his own mind, lost in a labyrinth of his own creation. His isolation, once a refuge, had become a suffocating weight. The walls of his office, once symbols of power and control, now felt like the bars of a prison. The empire he had built, which once stretched out like an unstoppable force, was now a crumbling monument to his own failures. Despite his mounting paranoia, Matteo refused to relinquish control. He couldn't. It was all he had left, the last thread of his identity. Yet, the empire he had carefully crafted with such precision had begun to betray him. His once loyal associates began to question his decisions, and whispers of dissent spread through the ranks. The trust that had bound them all together had eroded over time, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Matteo could feel it every time he walked through his operations, the cold stares and the subtle avoidance. The empire that had once thrived on loyalty and respect was now teetering on the edge of collapse. What remained of his organization was fractured, the threads of power that had once held it together now unraveling before his very eyes. His closest lieutenants, those he had trusted most, began to make quiet moves of their own. They began to distance themselves from Matteo, unsure of where his mind had gone. Some of them whispered about taking control, about how they could lead the organization more effectively, with less paranoia and more clarity. They saw Matteo's growing instability as a weakness, one that could be exploited for their own gain. What had once been a tightly knit unit now looked like a pack of wolves, each one circling Matteo, waiting for the moment to strike. But Matteo, even as he saw the signs of rebellion all around him, refused to acknowledge the truth. He couldn't. The thought of losing everything, of watching his empire crumble, was too much to bear. His pride, which had once been the driving force behind his rise, had now become his greatest weakness. It blinded him to the reality of his situation, kept him clinging to a past that was no longer his to control. He had become a relic, a symbol of a time when things had been different, when he had been untouchable. But now, he was a man out of sync with the world around him, unable to adapt to the changes that were happening within his own empire. The longer Matteo refused to confront the reality of his situation, the more his empire began to slip from his grasp. The lieutenants who had once carried out his orders with unquestioning loyalty began to make their own decisions, to act without his approval. They no longer feared him the way they once had. Some of them even began to openly challenge his authority, testing the limits of his control. Matteo, caught in the throes of his own delusion, tried to maintain the illusion of power. He grew more erratic, more unpredictable, and the cracks in his leadership became more pronounced. But it wasn't just the men around him who were starting to fall away. The very fabric of the empire itself was beginning to fray. The once steady stream of income from various illegal enterprises began to dwindle. Operations that had once been profitable were now struggling, and Matteo's once vibrant network of contacts seemed to dry up overnight. It was as though the world was moving on without him, leaving him behind in a shadow of his former self. No matter how hard he tried to hold on, he couldn't stop the inevitable decline. Matteo's descent into madness was not a sudden thing, but a gradual erosion of his mental state. It was as though the constant weight of his paranoia, coupled with the pressure to maintain control, had begun to slowly eat away at his sanity. His once sharp mind, the very thing that had earned him respect in the underworld, had become clouded by doubt and fear. He would often sit alone in his office, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of the chaos that had consumed him. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every phone call a sign of betrayal. The paranoia, once a tool for survival, had now turned against him, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. As the final days of his reign approached, Matteo found himself increasingly alienated from those around him. His isolation had grown so profound that even the most basic interactions with his lieutenants felt strained, awkward. The men who had once revered him now saw him as a liability, a man who could no longer provide the clarity or leadership they needed. They began to look elsewhere for guidance, seeking out new alliances, new sources of power. Matteo, in his desperation, tried to hold on, to remind them of the power he had once wielded, but it was too late. The world had moved on, and he was no longer the man they needed him to be. Matteo could feel the end coming, but he refused to accept it. His empire, the one he had poured his soul into, was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. His mind was no longer the sharp instrument of control it had once been. His thoughts were jumbled, his decisions increasingly erratic. He no longer had the ability to inspire fear or loyalty in his subordinates. They saw him as a broken man, a former king clinging to the remnants of his throne. In his final moments of control, Matteo's behavior became even more erratic. He would lash out at anyone who spoke against him, no matter how small the infraction. His temper had become a weapon, but one that no longer struck fear into his men. It was a pathetic attempt to assert authority, a last-ditch effort to cling to the power he had once held so effortlessly. But even his anger failed him. It no longer had the weight it once did. His empire, once a symbol of strength and control, was now a hollow shell, and Matteo was the last one left to watch it crumble. The end, when it came, was not with a bang but a whimper. Matteo had spent so long in denial, so long refusing to see that his empire was falling apart, that when the final blow came, he was already too far gone to stop it. Betrayal came from within, as the men closest to him finally made their move, consolidating power and removing Matteo from the picture. They had no use for a broken, paranoid leader. His time had passed. Matteo's empire, the one he had built from the ground up, was no longer his to command. It had slipped away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the wreckage of his once great legacy. The man who had once ruled with an iron fist was now a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The underworld, like the world itself, had moved on without him, leaving him in the shadows, a ghost of his former self. As Matteo faded from power, he was left to ponder the futility of it all. The empire that had given him purpose, that had defined his very existence, was gone. And in its place was a man alone, trapped in his own mind, with nothing left but the echoes of his former glory. Matteo's downfall was a quiet affair, a slow unraveling of a once great empire that had once seemed invincible. As the final threads of his control slipped away, the world he had built around him seemed to collapse in on itself, leaving only the faintest traces of what it once was. His name, once whispered with reverence in the dark corners of the criminal underworld, now felt hollow, a relic of a bygone age. The empire he had spent decades constructing was no longer his to command. The men who had once followed him with unwavering loyalty now turned their backs on him, leaving him to fade into obscurity. In his final days, Matteo seemed to retreat into himself even more, a ghost of the man he had once been. His mind, which had once been sharp, now wandered in a haze of confusion and regret. He would sit alone in his office, staring blankly at the walls, as if waiting for something, anything, to bring him back to the world he once dominated. But nothing came. No visitors, no messages, no calls. The empire that had once thrived on his command was now a silent monument to his failures. There was a profound sense of loss that weighed heavily on Matteo during this time. The riches, the power, the respect, these things had once meant everything to him. They had defined who he was, given him purpose and identity. But now, as he sat alone in his desolate office, surrounded by the remnants of his former life, those things seemed empty. The gold-plated decorations on the walls, the lavish furnishings, the priceless art, none of it held the same meaning anymore. He had spent his entire life building this empire, but now it felt like an anchor, dragging him down into the depths of despair. What had it all been for? He was alone, isolated, and broken. The men who had once served him with loyalty now saw him as a liability, a man who could no longer keep the empire intact. They whispered behind his back, discussing what to do with him. Some wanted to eliminate him altogether, to remove him from the picture completely. Others, more cautious, sought to distance themselves from him and take control of the pieces that remained. But Matteo, in his isolation, was oblivious to these machinations. He had become a mere shadow of his former self, no longer the commanding presence he had once been. His mind, once a sharp instrument for navigating the treacherous world of organized crime, had dulled with age and fear. He no longer had the clarity to see the moves of those around him, and in his isolation, he had become a pawn in the game he had once mastered. Matteo's paranoia had always been a tool, a means of protecting himself in the cutthroat world he inhabited. But now, it had become his prison. The fear that had once kept him sharp, alert, and in control had now consumed him, turning him into a man constantly looking over his shoulder, unsure of who to trust. He had surrounded himself with enemies, both real and imagined, and in doing so, he had alienated himself from the very people who had once been his allies. His ability to lead had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer capable of inspiring loyalty or fear in his men. His empire had fractured, and he was powerless to stop it. As Matteo's empire crumbled, the memory of his name faded into the annals of time. The underworld, which had once bent to his will, now moved on, leaving behind only the ruins of his legacy. There was no grand final showdown, no dramatic conclusion. His fall was as gradual as it was inevitable, a slow dissolution that rendered even his most loyal allies silent. The name Matteo Ardenti became nothing more than a whisper in the dark corners of the city, a tale of a man who had once commanded an empire and, in the end, had lost everything. In the months that followed the collapse of his empire, Matteo's name was rarely mentioned, except perhaps in passing conversation or among the older generation of mobsters who still remembered the days when he had ruled with an iron fist. But even their recollections were tinged with a sense of melancholy. The man who had once been a force to be reckoned with had become a footnote in the grander history of organized crime. He was no longer the feared figure he had once been. Instead, he had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful empires could fall, and that even the strongest leaders could falter. The new players in the game, those who had risen to power in the wake of Matteo's downfall, wasted little time in erasing his influence from the streets. They quickly moved to consolidate their power, establishing new alliances and making their own mark on the city. They knew that Matteo's reign had been a brief chapter in the larger story of the criminal world, and they were eager to write their own. There was no place for nostalgia in the underworld, only power, and the ruthless pursuit of it. Matteo's former associates, those who had once fought alongside him, now found themselves scattered. Some of them disappeared entirely, retreating into the shadows, leaving the criminal world for good. Others, more ambitious, sought to carve out their own piece of the pie, using the lessons they had learned from Matteo's rise and fall to their advantage. A few of them, however, were left with nothing but regret. They had placed their trust in Matteo, believing in the man he had once been, only to find themselves left with nothing when the empire collapsed. It was a bitter lesson, one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But what of Matteo himself? Where did he go after the dust had settled and the last remnants of his empire had been wiped away? The answer, like the rest of his life, is a mystery. Some say he faded into obscurity, living out his final days in isolation, cut off from the world he had once ruled. Others believe he sought out vengeance, driven by the same ambition that had once propelled him to the top. Perhaps he sought to rebuild what he had lost, to reclaim the power that had slipped through his fingers. But in the end, there is no record of Matteo's final years. The man who had once been the center of so much attention was now nothing more than a fading memory, his fate left to speculation and rumor. One theory, often whispered among those who still remembered the old days, is that Matteo died a broken man, his once great empire reduced to nothing more than a faded dream. In the years that followed the fall of Matteo Ardenti's empire, the legend of his rise and collapse lingered in the criminal world, echoing through the halls of those who had witnessed his dominance and witnessed his inevitable demise. Matteo was not simply remembered as a cautionary tale, his life was viewed as a paradox, a study in contradictions that both intrigued and repelled those who had known him. He was the thinker who had carved out an empire from nothing, only to lose it to the very paranoia and ambition that had once driven him to the heights of power. For the new generation of crime lords, his legacy was both a blueprint and a warning, a guide to success and a cautionary note on the price of overreaching. But while his empire had been erased from the map, its impact could still be felt. The influence Matteo had wielded, however fleeting, left scars that would never fully heal. His rivals, who had once fought so hard to undermine him, found themselves forever haunted by his shadow. Even in their success, they had to contend with the knowledge that they had outlasted a giant. They had risen through sheer force of will, yes, but many knew they could never replicate the brilliance that had been Matteo's. Some even found themselves admiring him from afar, the way you might admire a dangerous predator for its sheer power and cunning. Matteo's death, however it had come, remained a mystery. Some say he died alone, in the quiet confines of a dimly lit room, his health decaying just as his empire had. Others claim his final moments were far more dramatic, a violent end at the hands of those who had once been his closest allies. But the truth, as with much of Matteo's life, would never be fully known. What was certain, however, was that his disappearance left a void. It was a void that no one could quite fill, no matter how hard they tried. The memory of his power lingered like a ghost in the corridors of the underworld, a specter that reminded everyone of what had once been, and what could still be lost. The rise and fall of Matteo Ardenti served as a grim reminder that in the world of organized crime, there were no permanent victories. Power could be gained in a moment, but it could also be lost in the blink of an eye. The underworld, like any other world, was constantly shifting, constantly evolving. New players emerged, old alliances crumbled, and the game was always in flux. Matteo had been a master of that game, but in the end, even he could not escape its unforgiving nature. His downfall had been swift, but not without its moments of tension. For those who had known him, the signs had been there all along. His paranoia had slowly begun to erode the foundations of the empire he had spent years building. His allies had become his enemies, and his enemies had become his allies. Trust, the very thing upon which his empire had been built, had been broken. And once that trust was gone, so too was his power. The man who had once commanded loyalty and fear found himself abandoned, his empire crumbling around him like a house of cards. But even in the face of his ruin, Matteo never gave up on his belief in himself. He remained convinced that he could rebuild, that his intelligence and vision could bring him back from the brink. Perhaps that was his greatest flaw, the inability to see that what he had lost could never be regained. The forces of time and change had moved on without him, and by the time he realized it, it was too late. In the aftermath of his fall, many people had different takes on what Matteo's life meant. To some, he was a tragic hero, a man who had achieved greatness only to lose it all. They remembered his strategic brilliance, his ability to think several steps ahead of his opponents, and his iron will. To them, he was a symbol of ambition taken too far, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds could be undone by their own excess. For them, his story was one of wasted potential, a man who could have achieved so much, but who was ultimately consumed by the very forces he had sought to control. To others, Matteo was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man whose arrogance and pride had led to his undoing. They saw him as a figure who had never understood the transient nature of power, who had never realized that even the most powerful empires were subject to the whims of time. To them, his story was one of hubris, a tale of a man who had reached for the stars and had fallen back to earth with a thud. His legacy, in their eyes, was a stark warning, that power, no matter how great, was fleeting, and those who pursued it too relentlessly would ultimately find themselves consumed by it. And then there were those who remembered him as a figure who had lived by his own rules. Matteo had never bowed to anyone, never compromised his vision for the sake of convenience or safety. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he had done so on his own terms. In the ruthless world of organized crime, that was something to be admired. For them, Matteo's legacy was one of defiance, a symbol of a man who had lived and died by his own code, regardless of the consequences.